Ever get that feeling that some really important figures from the past just sort of vanish from the main story, you know?
It happens more often than you'd think.
Yeah. Okay. So let's unpack this. We've been looking into Haji Hussein Jama, right?
Yeah.
Also known as Haji Diide in Djibouti.
That's right.
This man, he lived until 1920, a huge figure, politics, business, managed a lot of wealth. Sources say one of the most influential Somali businessmen of his time.
Absolutely. Significant influence.
So it really makes you wonder, how does someone like that become, well, someone whose history might have been deliberately kind of overlooked, according to some sources anyway?
It's a really powerful question. And what we see in the translated scripts we looked at is the story of someone whose impact was just immense, really far-reaching.
So in this deep dive, we're trying to piece together his life, his impact.
Exactly. We want to understand Haji Diide, his life, his accomplishments, and maybe explore why his contributions aren't perhaps as widely known today, based on the evidence we've got.
Okay, so who is Haji Diide? The basics first. Sources say born in Lukaya, that's in the Awdal region.
Correct. And he passed away in Djibouti itself in 1920.
We even know a bit about his family, don't we? A son, Mahmoud Haji Diide.
Yes, and a daughter, Kaji Haji Diide.
And interestingly, it's mentioned that descendants from his daughter's side, they're still around today.
It brings it home, doesn't it? These aren't just names in a history book. There's a living legacy.
Totally. So if we're looking at this idea of fading from memory, where does his story of impact actually begin? What made him stand out?
Well, professionally, his reputation just leaps out from the pages.
Yeah.
The translated scripts consistently paint him as really one of the most renowned merchants across the Horn of Africa.
And this wasn't just during the colonial period.
No, his influence started even before that. We see him expanding his business, moving operations from Zila to Djibouti. That happened after the port opened there.
Ah, okay. So that shift was significant.
Hugely significant. It really reshaped trade in the region, and he was right there at the center of it all.
And we're not talking small-scale stuff here, are we? This was a big operation.
Oh, definitely. His network, his commercial reach, it went all the way to Dir Haba and Harar in Ethiopia.
Wow. Ethiopia as well.
Yes. Plus substantial livestock holdings back in northern Somalia, you know, between Zila and Lukaya.
So he wasn't just treating goods, he was like building the economic foundations.
You could absolutely say that. And him helping establish Djibouti's Chamber of Commerce later on, that really cemented it.
Right. It's like he was building the infrastructure for the future, not just participating.
Precisely. That Chamber of Commerce role shows real foresight, a commitment to Djibouti's economy. But, you know, his influence wasn't just economic.
No, the charitable side is huge in these accounts.
It really is. The translated scripts spend a lot of time detailing his contributions to the community. Very significant.
Yeah, like the first major mosque in Djibouti's second district, Masjid Haji Diide, built before 1900, funded by him.
A cornerstone, exactly. But it went way beyond that, didn't it?
It really did. He donated land for the French school. And amazingly, it was actually named after him. That's quite something.
Huge recognition, yes.
And also land for the Community Development Center, the Chamber of Commerce building itself, even the Ministry of Interior.
It paints a picture of someone deeply invested in the fabric of the city.
This wasn't just charity. It feels like strategic investment, laying the groundwork for Djibouti's key institutions.
And what's also fascinating, there's that specific detail about the 30 houses he donated.
Oh, right. Tell us about that.
Well, they weren't just giveaways. The idea was for the income from these houses to fund the mosque's upkeep, ongoing maintenance.
That shows incredible planning, long-term thinking.
It really does. A sustainable commitment. It's unfortunate the sources suggest they were misappropriated later on.
Yeah, that's a shame. But his original intention, it speaks volumes about his vision for community support.
Absolutely. His character shines through there.
Okay, so we've got this picture. Incredibly successful businessman, major community benefactor. But there's this other layer, isn't there? Which might be key to this whole erased history angle.
Yes. His resistance to colonialism.
The translated scripts are pretty clear on this, right? He strongly opposed French colonial plans.
Fiercely opposed them. He was seen as a major barrier to their expansion right up until he died in 1920.
So this influential figure shaping the economy, building the community, but also pushing back against the colonial power.
Exactly. And his opposition wasn't just, you know, quiet disagreement. He actively engaged with the French administration.
How so?
The sources specifically mention agreements he signed with the French. And crucially, these agreements recognized Djibouti as Somali territory.
Okay, wait. That's huge. Somali territory.
Mm.
That implies a future maybe linked with a larger Somalia.
That's the implication, yes. Which, of course, directly clash with what the French wanted long-term, a separate Djibouti.
Right, and don't the sources also mention the later French strategy after we died?
They do. They touch upon how the French started positioning collaborators, specifically to prevent Djibouti from joining the Federal Republic of Somalia, which eventually led to Djibouti becoming independent on its own.
Okay, let me see if I'm connecting these dots right. Haji Diide, powerful guy, makes agreements recognizing Djibouti as Somali land. Later, the French push for a separate independent Djibouti.
Yes.
Could his stance, those early agreements, could that be why his history might be framed as, deliberately erased by those who wanted Djibouti to go down a different path?
That's a very plausible connection to draw from the source material, isn't it?
His vision just clashed directly with the way things eventually turned out.
It seems so. His stance on Somali territory and his opposition to French expansion certainly put him at odds with those later colonial goals. But it's also interesting that his contributions were remembered and acknowledged, at least by some. The Islamic Affairs Council of Djibouti, people who knew him.
So the memory wasn't totally gone.
No, not entirely. The original records were in Arabic, later translated into Somali. It suggests his legacy persisted, maybe within specific communities or institutions, even if it wasn't part of the, let's say, dominant public narrative later on.
Which raises that big question about whose stories get told and why. Who gets to shape the national history?
Exactly. Power dynamics and historical narratives.
Okay, so let's try and sum this up. Haji Diide, massive businessman, regional network, huge philanthropist, funded key institutions, and a determined opponent of French colonialism, even signing agreements that recognized Djibouti as Somali.
A truly multifaceted figure.
Yet despite all this documented impact, there's this persistent idea reflected in the sources that his history might have been sidelined, maybe deliberately. These translated scripts give us this incredible glimpse, but that contrast between his known influence and the potential erasure.
It really makes you think about how history gets written, doesn't it? It really does. That tension is what's so compelling. His clear influence versus this suggestion of an obscured past. It forces you to think about the colonial period, the shaping of national identity.
Why some stories get amplified and others just fade.
Precisely. Whose narrative gets prioritized?
So, as we wrap up this deep dive on Haji Hussein Jama, Haji Diide, we're left with this big question, aren't we?
I think so.
Given everything we've seen, businessman, leader, anti-colonial figure, why might his story be framed as potentially deliberately erased?
Yeah.
What does that tell you, listening now, about how historical memory works, about the forces shaping how we see the present?
And maybe Haji Diede's story is a valuable lens, a way to look at the wider history of Djibouti and the Horn of Africa during that really critical time.
Yeah.
It definitely invites you to dig deeper, explore that colonial era more, look for other stories that might have been pushed aside, and just think about the impact people like Haji Diide had, an impact that might still resonate today, even if their names aren't always the first ones mentioned.